What's up, everybody? Welcome to This Podcast Should Be Played Loud. I'm Alan Palomo, and as always, I am joined by my co-host, Chad Harbolt. Today, we are discussing none other than unexpected hit, Kane Parsons Backrooms. Chad, you just saw this, right, a couple days ago?
Yes, exactly. I saw it at the Alamo Draft House, downtown Brooklyn, and I was very impressed with it. I was somewhat aware of this whole kind of backstory and lore and YouTube series. I watched the first short film before seeing it, but other than that, it was all kind of new stuff to me.
You know, I was a little bit more familiar with his stuff, primarily not because of Backrooms, but 2 years ago, he had a short that I believe was called The Rolling Giant, or it's how it came to be known, that was about a demolished mall in Dallas. And it was weird because it was kind of like, I remember that mall, but he made this exact replica of it underground, and a friend of mine had recommended it to me. And I knew about his kind of like pure cinema sort of just ambient horror vibe and his connection to like the whole kind of Reddit liminal space thing. But I was pleasantly surprised with this movie. You know, I had a lot of skepticism, and I also want to get into why we're going to talk about it, because if you're a first-time listener, we usually do music-centric films. We either focus on a musician turned filmmaker or actor, or we highlight a specific film that has some parallel with music, whether it be the soundtrack, whether it be the depiction of an artist or a scene, or just a kick-ass music with or a kick-ass film with some good tunes in it. But particularly, I wanted to have this episode about Backrooms, not just because it's the hot thing that everybody's talking about this week, because it's breaking box office records as an independent horror film, also coupled with Obsession, which came out 2 weeks ago, and we can talk about that stuff as well. But I want to kind of bring you into why I wanted to do this episode, Chad. So I had this realization while watching Backrooms. There's a scene where Renee Rienzvi, is that how we pronounce her name?
I believe so.
Okay, yeah. So there's a scene where Renee's character is hosting some kind of get-together, and they needle drop this song called Ulterior Motives that went viral on Reddit like 3 years ago because nobody could figure out where it was from. So if you remember, yeah, there's a scene where she is hosting people, but she walks out into the other room, and they don't just outright play the song. You kind of hear it as diegetic audio muffled in the other room, and I immediately I recognized it. I was like, wait 1 fucking minute, it has to be that song.
You clocked it just from that? Wow.
Well, it's a strange story because, all right, so this song first appeared on Reddit's Lost Wave thread as a mysterious 17-second clip, which, if you don't know what that is, it's a community of people that will post songs that were quote-unquote mysteriously found on an old iPod or hard drive, etc., but can't determine the artist or era from which it came from. And it's funny because when Reddit was speculating as to who wrote this song, I kept getting tagged by people who were claiming that it was a lost demo of mine. And I mean, you know, I thought it was funny. I know. I mean, I thought it was funny because, if anything, it sounded more like an early Ariel Pink song to me, like something from like Doldrums or Loverboy. But my intention then became to write a speculative cover of it, by which I mean filling out the rest of the missing song. Like, I was talking to my brother, like, okay, this clip sounds like a pre-chorus going into a chorus, so can we make up some verses and take credit for writing this mysterious song? I mean, I was obviously going to troll. But before I could do that,
you were just going to add to the lore, right?
I was going to add to the lore. Yeah. And not even, I mean, you know, I mean, a speculative cover also sounded like a fun challenge because you're really just being given one puzzle piece, right?
It's like an exquisite corpse in a way, right? Like, completely. Yeah. And I mean, I'm sure the irony isn't lost on you that it's sort of that is, and that's probably why he ended up using a song like that too, is because this whole Backrooms thing is a bit of an exquisite corpse. I mean, we'll get to it later, but I think there's an interesting discussion of this sort of open-ended IP
Oh
this
yeah.
film is.
It
But
it
please
really plays
continue.
with the idea of authorship and internet folklore.
Correct.
But
Yes.
before I could do the speculative cover, somebody finally figured out the song's origin. And funny enough, the song was from a 1986 porno titled "Angels of Passion," which I watched only for the research. It's like the Simpsons joke where Principal Skinner claims that he only went to the burlesque house on how to get directions to get away from there. But I mean, there's multiple bangers from this writer, this guy Christopher St. Booth, who I guess just licensed his songs out for this porn, and they'd never been properly released, which has to suck. That like that's all you thought your music was worth when you made it almost 40 years ago, and later it becomes viral. You know, this song went viral in a way where like these weird kind of 80s influencers, people that dress up like, I mean, you know, the internet, you can find anything now. There's everything is simultaneously cool and uncool. There's no like concurrent dominant thread of cool anymore. So if you love the 60s, that can be your fucking thing. You can be some weird John Lennon impersonator. But there were people that, you know, there are influencers that just, they have their rooms look like the 80s and they make memes about what life must have presumably been like. And I remember seeing this one video of some girl, you know, it looks like she's studying for a test or something, and she's like, imagine listening to this 17-second clip and not realizing that it's going to, you know, have viral infamy 40 years later. And it just goes to show that the internet loves a good mystery. You know, a folk practice of uncovering forgotten artifacts. And this is where I had my larger epiphany about the film's conceptual beginnings, because and look, we'll talk about the movie. We should definitely review the movie, but I want to get through my theories about it and how it relates to music, primarily vaporwave. And I swear this all ties back into Backrooms. We're taking the scenic route, so to speak, the backroom route.
Sounds great.
Yeah. Okay, so I really don't think that Backrooms would exist without Vaporwave. And hear me out.
I also want us to define some terms here for the lay people. Like, you know, let's not assume everyone knows what Vaporwave is.
Completely. And in general, also, I mean, I think that a lot of people are kind of learning about what liminal spaces are. It's so funny hearing, like, watching these news segments of like middle-aged squares, you know, just being like, they're called liminal spaces and Gen Z is obsessed with them. I mean, yeah, it's watching that phenomenon of like internet language kind of suddenly become mainstream. Like imagine like Tucker Carlson being like, what is going on? You know, like it used to be that a house... It used to be that a house could only be as big on the inside as it appears on the outside. Not right. Anymore, according to Gen Z. They want to live in a non-Euclidean nightmare. What is going on in this country?
I also think I'm curious as to your theories too of like why in particular Gen Z is obsessed with liminal spaces, especially because it feels like they have sort of ceased to exist for them in reality, and maybe that's part of it. Like we're talking about malls and stuff, like malls are gone, you know, like totally. That, and maybe that is where the fascination comes from.
Well, the thing is, like, the reason why I bring up Vaporwave is that I think before it was verbalized, before it was kind of like creepypastified, because a lot of this all started on creepypasta, in particular the Backrooms post.
Yeah,
totally. I think that, and music kind of sometimes has a way of doing it first, you know, because it's something that can be so easily generated by one person. But Vaporwave, okay, so it's going to sound kind of roundabout, but all right. So Vaporwave is an early internet music genre that grew out of chillwave, you know, which was a term coined by Hipster Runoff.
Which you are a pioneer of.
Sure. Yeah. It was used to, it was kind of a joke term to describe what the music sounded like that, you know, contemporaries of mine like Washed Out and Tori Moa and myself were doing. But it's basically was like Vaporwave specifically was this offshoot that was described as typically a sampling or repurposing of corporate culture tropes from the 80s and 90s. And it was all kind of tied together by this idea of like hauntology, you know, like the idea that modern society is haunted by the unfulfilled utopian promises of the past, as best represented by the abandoned shopping malls of the 90s.
Wow, that's fascinating.
So, and that was kind of, I mean, for me, chillwave, like, you know, some of this stuff is like a rationalization that happens sort of after the fact. I think at the time, you know, there were certain conceptual elements that we were sort of gunning for, but I also think the lo-fi component of it and the 80s aspect of it, I mean, I think it was just kind of like right place, right time. You know, I was a child of the 80s, therefore I had my own kind of personal nostalgia about it. And lo-fi music was kind of a way of exploring that because it didn't require the more tedious, refined aspects of making like a well-produced album. It was something you could just do. It was like punk expression. At least it felt that way to me. But this idea of hauntology, you know, it made Vaporwave out to be like basically like dead mall music, like elevator music, music for commercials, smooth jazz, R&B, new age, like that sort of thing. And what makes it uniquely a product of the internet is just how visual its aesthetic is. And the music almost kind of takes a backseat to the album artwork, the music videos, the Tumblr posts about it, you know, 4chan, Reddit posts. And the visual content for it was typically like chopped up 80s and 90s commercials for like Coke, Pepsi, a lot of electronics, like stereos, camcorders, VCRs, like the fetishizing of antiquated technology and really mall culture is what it's like, you know, the idea that you would go to an electronics store and you'd be surrounded by gadgets and gizmos and obviously this life before we ordered everything on our fucking phone or computer, you know, which is all but died. And it's the basically like the death of like physical space capitalism, like the literal marketplace. And look, this is up for debate because it comes off as highly pretentious, but all right, so some people believe that Vaporwave is a riff on one of potentially two things. I think the more realistic one is that it's a riff on the term vaporware, which is a product, typically like computer hardware or software that is announced, but is never necessarily released. It's, you know, significantly delayed or just straight up canceled. So it's like lost software.
Okay.
The idea of a program that is never released. And the other one, which is the more pretentious one, is that it's a reference to a Karl Marx term that is used to describe a perpetual repetition of ideals which are not concrete or meaningful in their philosophy, and therefore described as waves of vapor. And I actually think that that's actually a great way to describe what the music actually sounds like, because a lot of it is kind of loop-based and not really about anything in particular, just the pastiche of capitalism and the pastiche of nostalgia and commercials and pop culture from a bygone era. But, you know, these are things that probably, like, to the people that were making it, probably just sounded cool, and, like, you know, we retroactively project meaning onto it. But it's important to note that the first, like, definitive Vaporwave album was from dear friend of the pod, Danny LePatin, otherwise known as One of Tricks Point Never, otherwise known as Chuck Person, which was the pseudonym that he used for Echo Jams, which people kind of credit as like the godfather of all like Vaporwave releases. That was the first one that kicked things off.
And composer of Marty Supreme, correct?
Oh yeah. And Uncut Gems and Good Time, you know, frequent collaborator with the Softies and more recently with The Weeknd as well. But in his humble beginnings as a noise bro from Boston, he made this mixtape, Echo Jams, and it was kind of a collection of slowed down loops from like corny late 80s R&B pop songs, the biggest which sampling Lady in Red by Krista Burge, and it's just the line "there's nobody here" repeating for like 5 minutes. There's nobody here. And it's like, it's actually, I mean, it's funny, but it's also genuinely very unsettling. And he started posting these videos onto YouTube under a YouTube channel called Sunset Corp, where he'd chop up these Japanese commercials along with the music. And there's one called Angel that's my favorite that samples Fleetwood Mac's Only Over You. And it's just the line, "I miss you when you're gone. Angel, please don't go." It just loops. So it's this idea, you know, you're making these kind of, it's like weird music concrete. It's plunderphonics, I guess, is another term for it that was coined in the '80s. But Dan later, as one of Tricks Point Never, makes an album almost entirely out of samples from old commercials after buying someone's collection of them on VHS off eBay, and that's like kind of like his first like seminal album called Replica. And a lot of people have gone down the rabbit hole on Reddit to find every tiny micro sample from every fucking commercial. Because some people because some people suddenly, it triggers some bizarre latent nostalgia when they hear that, whatever that snare sound, that cymbal, or that little vocal sample from a commercial that they can't quite trace or pin, and it goes back to this idea of the hauntology of it.
Yeah, it's like an ASMR of tip of your brain, something from your childhood, and you're also now starting to touch on things that are explicitly in Backrooms, where we're talking about its setting of at a furniture store that would never exist today.
Exactly. So, and
has commercials.
So there's two other albums I'll just quickly credit for pioneering the vaporwave style, like James Ferraro's Far Side Virtual, which sounds he was a very, and still is, very, very prolific artist through the 2000s, 2010s, had a ton of pseudonyms. But Far Side Virtual, which I remember, like when it came out, I think that was like the record of the year for Fact Magazine in England. For some reason in England, they really fucked with this album. But it sounds like Windows 95 music on like psilocybin. Like I'll just read you some of these song titles. And now these sound like total cliches, but at the time, looking back on 90s corporate culture was a very novel idea. Palm Trees, Wi-Fi, and Dream Sushi. Starbucks, Dr. Seussism, and While Your Mac is Sleeping. Condo Pets, my favorite one. Global Lunch. Like just these weird throwaway terms for what it must have been like to work in an office space in the 90s, and reimagining it as some, psychedelic electronic album. There's one more, and this one, I think it's a good record, but also I think more so visually, the artwork kind of helped define that kind of vaporwave quote unquote style. And this one was Macintosh Plus's Floral Shop. And yeah, so after the initial splash, not unlike Chillwave, it was just followed by like an endless drove of imitators and offshoots that kind of diluted and diminished the novelty of it all. And I think it's also in part because of, it's easy music to make if you want to make it lazily, like the idea of lo-fi in terms of Chillwave was like, well, yeah, now you don't have to worry about mixing the song. You can just drench it in distortion and reverb. And for a lot of people, that was kind of a crutch. I think that was kind of why I sort of pivoted away from it so quickly. And maybe I shouldn't have, I don't know. But I think because there were so many people starting to do that type of music, I kind of, then suddenly wanted to make this like 8-bit shoegaze album and just had different concepts for things I wanted to make. And a similar thing happened with Vaporwave, where because you could just chop up, old commercials and city pop Japanese records and forgotten 80s jingles, it kind of lost its oomph. It just started getting diluted by this online community. And that's not to say, look, I will say there are exceptions, like George Clanton, I think, definitely continued to build on it and eventually sort of marry it with shoegaze, not only through his work, but his label 100% Electronica that has some really excellent releases. But mentioning its dilution and offshoots is important to tying it back into Backrooms, because of the post-vaporwave subgenre mallsoft, which I know sounds totally idiotic, but this was an offshoot that was particularly preoccupied with the idea of making music for dead malls, and this is where the idea of liminal spaces and backrooms starts to form. So there's a website that I vaguely remember, go figure, that would just let you listen to mall ambiance, and it had what I would describe as this very kind of vaporwave looking mall setting, like white tiles, neon signs, those cups with the airbrush art that's literally referred to as jazz.
Right.
Yeah. And there was even an online radio show from Vienna called Dead Mall Music. So this idea of just kind of making like creepy, washed out music with baked in retail announcements, was kind of starting to take shape. And I think this growing obsession with the death of malls and also office spaces and the idea of like social spaces in an increasingly online world start to culminate in a creepy pasta posted onto 4chan called The Backrooms, right? This is where now we come to understand the origins of this particular movie and Kane Parsons and how he kind of reinvented it. And the Backrooms post was basically just a picture of an empty office space with that same yellow kind of crusty looking wallpaper from the Backrooms movie, which actually turned out to be from a de facto furniture store in Milwaukee. So now Kane Parsons didn't make that original post. Like he later made a YouTube homage to it in 2022, I believe.
I believe we don't know who made the original post. I think it's just an anonymous person on 4chan.
Which is how it should be. I mean, if we're talking about,
right.
This idea of memory, collective memory.
And then people just continued to kind of add to it, as they would on 4chan. It's a picture of a Backrooms, not dissimilar to what's in the movie, and a kind of one sentence, warning or origin or prelude to a sort of nightmare, and then people just kind of kept adding to it, and then Kane Parsons, who was a teenager at the time and during the pandemic, taught himself Blender, a 3D CG animation software, and started making short films exploring those types of spaces, and they immediately blew up. The first one has almost 200 million views as of now.
Yeah, and that's the thing. So his first short, really, I would imagine he thought was just making a cool homage to that, this idea of liminal spaces and specifically the Backrooms post. It's one of those things where I don't think you can credit one person in particular. It's just one of these concepts that was just in the ether. By 2021, before Kane even made that first Backrooms short, the Backrooms post had evolved into a liminal space Reddit that had like 500,000 members posting their own liminal space images. But what Kane did do is narrativize this concept,
Right.
And I use the term loosely because he was making what I would refer to as like pure cinema, like Gaspar Noé sometimes does in Enter the Void, like no dialogue, no story. You're just kind of experiencing the visuals and the environment, often in POV.
But from what I understand too, and I haven't watched the entire web series, which I think clocks in at around, almost 3 hours between, over a dozen kind of short films. From what I understand, they do become more narrativized as they go along, and the lore gets explained a little bit more, and the sort of, the scientist characters that also appear in the Backrooms and whoever they represent start to sort of appear as well. So it is narrativized in a way, but not in the same way as a traditional narrative film or even web series, where I think you could argue that the film, the A24 film, has some sort of experimental narrative elements. You could also just as easily say it follows the sort of logic of a video game. Like you could call it a sort of David Lynch dream logic, or you could call it, he has cited the video games Portal and Portal 2 as just as much of influences as on him as something like Twin Peaks.
Right. And before we start talking about the movie, I do want to mention, I remember now the name of the Dead Mall series he did, which was called The Oldest View, and I think parentheses Rolling Giant, about someone that becomes trapped in some liminal underground mall that's a replica of a mall that was demolished in Dallas. And the monster that chases you in that video which he calls
Oh,
the rolling
looks a
giant,
lot like, yes,
the
yes.
pirate monster in the film. Which, let's get into it. I mean, basically this preamble that I wanted to explain is that I believe that Backrooms is the culmination of a decade's worth of internet hauntology that I'll just say right here and right now, you wouldn't have without Vaporwave, and to a much lesser extent, maybe Chillwave. But I'm going to give it to Vaporwave. And
But I
why?
think that's
Yeah.
fascinating because when you say stuff like, "Oh, well, was in the ether," it's like, well, what does that really mean? It actually has practical origins, like you're saying.
Yes.
It only gets into the ether because certain artists, kind of pick it out of the collective memory and generate content out of it and disseminate it to a larger audience, and that audience grows until it creates a critical mass to the point that a semi-traditional studio is willing to spend $10 million to make a feature film out of it.
Oh yeah. Um, well, let's get into the film because I have varying opinions about it. I'll overall say that I like it. I endorse it. I think it's good. I don't think it's great, but I do think that I think the concept and its execution via the YouTube Shorts on its own is interesting enough that if you barely put together a story that weaves in and out of these kind of POV sequences, it already makes for a compelling movie because the strongest aspects of it were the things that I guess the fans were already familiar with, which is the aesthetic, the vibe of it. Seeing it not on VHS, I think was already a huge gamble. To try to put a recognizable actor walking through that space. But I liked it, man. I mean, what was your read on it?
I like it too. And, I think that I know that a lot of people, the kind of criticism, the common criticisms is of the, either some people kind of couch it in, the screenplay itself, which is not written by Kane. He was, I think, by his sort of bevy of A-list horror producers, paired with a writer named Will Sudick, who I'm not super familiar with, but is like a traditional sort of TV writer, like wrote on Homeland, Westworld, Ash versus Evil Dead, which does make sense. And I think, but a lot of the criticisms of the movie come around this sort of quote unquote like normal movie stuff,
Yeah.
like the kind of character scenes between Chiwetel Ejiofor and Renata Rensby. And I completely understand all of that, but part of me thought that was just really interesting and not uncompelling to me as well. And the way those sort of scenes fit in with the more experimental, liminal space YouTube short kind of world of the film, and the way those things all clash together, I found pretty fascinating, even if those traditional scenes didn't quote unquote work in a traditional way. I remember, first hearing about this movie, this deal that happened. I had never really heard of the Backrooms, but I, read the deadline thing. Of course, I was immediately jealous of the 20-year-old
Oh
getting a
my
deal
god.
like this, which I'm sure many people can relate to. But then when I saw like, two of the best actors kind of in the game were going to be in this movie, and who are not who are never been in a horror movie before, either of them, and B, are not even really in that many wide release movies as leads. Like, I thought that was very interesting and unexpected, and exciting. I think they're both pretty fabulous in the movie. I think particularly Chiwetel has to sell a lot of nonsense in this
Oh
movie
yeah.
and is able to do it because he's so good. Kane has been talking in the press a little bit, and I think he's a seems like a nice kid and is an interesting guy, and I think has admitted to not being so much of a cinephile, although he does cite Punishment Park by Peter
Yeah, that
Watkins
was
as an
kind of, I mean, he had
influence,
to
which is
cite
like,
one deep one.
yeah, I mean that's a deep cut for the most part, like
Sure.
not it's not the deepest cut on earth, but there's a fair amount of people that I consider to be fans of movies that have not seen that movie.
Yeah.
So I thought that was an interesting site. And then he also talked about how his dad, after his divorce, went through a sort of Twin Peaks phase, which makes a lot of sense. I mean, and if you think of, I think it's also interesting too that this movie is about 40-year-olds, like plus, the sort of divorced dad energy of Chiwetel, does feel sort of lived in and personal in a way that I can imagine Kane might have uh, saw in his father. So I don't know. I mean, I think the narrative as of such is that Chiwetel is an angry, divorced, bitter, wannabe architect that owns a sort of flailing department store and has a therapist played by Renata Rensby. And he one night while he's living in the store because he's been kicked out of the house, he discovers a portal through a wall into the back rooms. He is fascinated and invigorated and thrilled by that. He's afraid of it, but keeps going back and starts discovering, mapping it out, figuring out what's going on in there. He tries to tell his therapist. She thinks he's crazy, understandably, and then he disappears and doesn't come back. She has her own trauma from childhood. We can sort of discuss. We'll probably spoil this movie by the end. You should go see
I
it.
should say, yeah, at this point now, we're definitely going to go into some spoilers.
Yes. Uh, she has some childhood trauma with related to her mother. We can sort of discuss. I'm a little fuzzy on sort of what the revelation there is at the end, but she goes to find him and gets caught up in this crazy world. But what's cool about it structurally is like you start with a kind of VHS first person version of this that is very similar to the shorts. That character who, kind of whoever he is, it disappears and is not really seen again. Then you have the sort of traditional narrative stuff with setting up Chiwetel and setting up Renata. And then we have an extended sequence of Chiwetel exploring the space. Then he disappears. Then we have some more sort of normal movie stuff with Renata, and then she enters the back rooms, and then that becomes kind of the rest of the movie, basically.
Right.
So it's a sort of very simple, almost directly like 5-act kind of structure that I think is cool and works and is very satisfying. I think much of it is, very scary and cool and unexpected, and these sort of I think the production design is fabulous, and I really hope it ends up with an Oscar nomination for at least that. I think something that is sort of under discussed about the visual aesthetic, at least, is that it reminded me a lot of AI in the sense that it is generating things that look like things that are familiar, but when you squint, you see how wrong they are in ways that you can kind of scan past them and not notice. It's
Yeah.
Chiwetel, in his way of sort of explaining what is happening in the back rooms, is that they are remembering things and are remembering things slightly wrong, and they describe it as if you were to describe to someone who's blind
that line,
what a dog is and ask them to draw one without knowing what it was, the result is something that's sort of in the backrooms, and I also feel like that's an interesting explanation for the visuals that AI creates often.
That's fair. That's fair. I mean, I I do think, as far as like what Kane believes the backrooms to be, I don't think even he fully understands. And I think, because the lore and the appeal of it in the beginning was really so much more about the vibe, the experience of walking through them. I mean, that line to me, the dog line was a little bit clunky. And look, do I wish that the story was a little bit more interesting and complex and better ties into the idea of liminal spaces beyond like, oh, he's an architect and she's a therapist. So you've got the physical aspect of it and the psychological aspect of it. Sure, but it's a movie made by a 19-year-old and his co-writer wasn't Charlie Kaufman. It's like some hired gun that does horror stuff. There were opportunities there, I think, where, in the moments when it reminded me of something like Eternal Sunshine, where or adaptation or being John Malkovich, but maybe more so being John Malkovich,
but also those movies aren't opening to $80 million, dude.
I know, no,
like,
for sure.
It's kind of like the simplicity of that. I agree is simple, but it also appeals to a wide audience in a way that they can understand.
And it's supposed to be a horror
you're selling
film
them
first.
a pretty weird idea that, like, I think having some building blocks that might feel a little bit obvious, like isn't so wrong, I guess.
That's fair. That's fair. I think it's funny because a lot of people kind of refer to liminal space horror stuff as like non-Euclidean horror, which the movie didn't do, actually. I was like, because when he's mapping out the space, I was like, well, if it was non-Euclidean, you wouldn't be able to map out the space.
Mm-hmm.
But despite that, when it goes into its climax, it kind of is just everything that it needed to be and not a drop more. You don't get this kind of big, like, it's collapsing in on itself kind of like climactic, fucking mainstream, Stranger Things kind of way of going about it. I think it avoided those tropes.
Chase scene.
Yeah. And it avoided those tropes. I think it did it very tastefully. And I'm not dogging on it.
And then it does have some way of explanation with Mark Duplass's kind of like scientist character coming in, which I have seen people say they didn't want entirely, or they wanted more explanation from him. For me, it was kind of the perfect
just right
amount, I guess.
Because even he doesn't know what it is.
Exactly. And I think that there was something really scary about how little he knew about it. And that as the person or part of the team that was tasked with studying it, how little they knew and how strange and terrifying it was that she was there and that Chiwetel was there. I thought that was the right amount of sort of tease to kind of tease out a larger conspiracy or world that I'm sure will now be explored in sequels and spinoffs. And then I think undeniably the final image of her fate in the backrooms is pretty fucking great.
Well, it is this idea that it's the way that all things go. Even the experience that we just sat through eventually just becomes a memory forgotten in the backrooms, and that I did think actually was pretty poignant. Because even in Chiwetel's like arc, I like that it's kind of antithetical. You have a character that doesn't grow, that doesn't learn. Eventually, his epiphany that his therapist gives him once they're in there is that he doesn't have to change if he doesn't want to. And it makes sense that he likes it in there because he doesn't have to move on. He can just stay stuck in his loop of forever revisiting his grudge against his wife or whatever,
Yes. I mean, I thought that scene is my sort of counter argument to the regular movie stuff is weak in this movie, where you have this sort of, and then also it's like, yeah, maybe he's not a cinephile, but he did do a Texas Chainsaw Massacre dinner scene. Like, I don't know, like that was a nice kind of reference to me. And I feel like there's different sort of kinds of horror that are getting into the soup here in all sort of cool ways. And she tells him this only kind of to save her ass, but when he sort of self-soothes and tells himself that it's okay, I'm actually fine, I don't have to change, even though we know he's kind of a piece of shit, like the way he is moved by that and sort of uses that to tell the monsters that now he has some degree of control over, that they don't have to do anything different, was pretty, I don't know, powerful to me and interesting to me in a way that I hadn't. Again, it just is my argument that this movie is more interesting than people are giving it credit for.
Well, and that the irony is that Chiwetel's like hostile vision of himself as this like failed architect turned desperate, like clownish TV pirate hawking furniture or whatever kills him. You know, I mean, even if he doesn't want to change, his hostility is like, no, I don't want to exist. Or what, you know, I mean, you could interpret it a variety of ways, but you know, the Frankenstein turns on him. And
yes, I think that's the thing that he is afraid he is, right? Like, or the thing he's afraid he's going to become, that he can't, he's not actually an architect. I mean, he says, I think she said, someone says something to him, oh, he used to be an architect, and he insists angrily, no,
like, I am a fucking architect. Yeah.
Yes. And this, you know, TV pirate shilling for shitty furniture is his kind of nightmare of himself.
Oh yeah. I mean, look, my two favorite sequences would probably be when Chiwetel lures his two employees and we get a great VHS POV horror sequence that ends in a space that literally looks like that Macintosh Plus floral shop album cover. Like it's just tile bathroom walls and a giant Roman bust. I thought that if you came to see Backrooms, that's the strongest sequence that commits to that bit. But my second favorite would be when we start in Renata's childhood living room and the camera just begins to pedestal down these endless floors where the room is further abstracted and misremembered until she wakes up in that weird dining room. And that to me, I mean, not only is it a really eerie, powerful image, I actually think the one in the film is better than the one in the trailer. Because I remember watching the trailer and being like, that's it? But they went back, you know, or maybe it was always just kind of an early VFX version of it. But I think it does tie, that image alone ties thematically into this idea of the levels of memory, you know, of just kind of things getting buried further and further underground as progress, quote unquote, begins to flourish on top. And I do think that, you know, the concept of the dead mall and what millennials and Gen Z might have as a connection to this bygone era, what happens to these buildings and our memories trapped within them, I do think is visually represented really well in that sequence. And the Texas Chainsaw dinner scene, actually it's I didn't think of it that way, but that's a perfect description of what that scene is like. I mean, there are little things about it, you know, I like that it ties back into the first conversation, which when you watch that scene, you know, the initial therapy scene, you're like, I don't know, man, this is kind of cringe. You're like, this is the movie stuff that might not work, but the fact that it ties back in so well, I think is a great payoff. And I do think that what we get past the dinner scene, all of that stuff is perfect. The chase, you know, the fact that she realizes that she's, you know, that the furniture store is trapped inside of the memory too. It's just now part of the back rooms. She's not actually in the room. She's in her memory of the room, or however you want to interpret that.
Yeah.
And the puppet is fucking great. You know, I mean, it's one of those things that you see now that is Hollywood kind of learning that you can integrate practical and VFX stuff, and get something really original that doesn't feel like
get
too much
something
of either.
really uncanny. It's like you're never like, I loved how with several of the kind of quote unquote monsters that are in there, you never quite get enough of a look at them to sort of really make your brain understand what you're looking at, and it's a great effect.
Absolutely. I think it's funny because I mean, the thing that stood out in my mind was the cinematography, not just inside of the back rooms, but the way the sky looked. Like there was a certain kind of artifice to all of it, and it reminded me of that line in True Detective where he's just like, you know, this place looks like the memory of a town that's fading, you know, or so, you know, I mean, with a more literal interpretation of that. But you know, I mean, having grown up in that era, and even the scene where Duplass's family is watching Neverending Story, which I was reminded of. I mean, I know that that's, that you could say that, oh, it's a film about another world, but I also remember, I don't know if it's Neverending Story 1 or 2, where the protagonist is, was it Atreyu, I think? He's like granted a wish. He develops the ability to make his wishes come true, but for every wish, he destroys another memory. And there's
this is adding to the surprising list of movies that I've never seen.
Okay, word.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, I don't know. I can't remember if they're watching Neverending Story 1 or 2, but there's a scene there's two traumatic scenes in those movies from my childhood. One is where the horse dies.
The horse, right? I've seen that clip.
Which
yeah.
People that are like, oh my God, 90s movies were so fucking traumatic. It's like, shut the fuck up. That scene's amazing. And yes, you should learn about death even at that age.
Yeah.
So yeah, the scene where the horse dies is great. It doesn't die. I mean, quicksand or whatever. But the other scene is that I think Atreyu is trying to climb up. Someone in the comments is gonna put me on blast because I don't know if Atreyu's the protagonist or the kid that's from the Neverending Story world. Anyway, there's a scene where he's trying to climb up a mountain and he just keeps wishing for another step to go up and up and up. And as he does, he's slowly forgetting who he is because for every wish, it costs him a memory of himself. Profound stuff for a kid's movie. But that was kind of when I saw that, I was like, maybe that's the maybe that's thematically what I'm supposed to tie into this film. But in the end, it's, I guess we come to understand that the Backrooms are slowly expanding and that everything's just becoming a memory. And I love that sequence of shots at the end. I think it was really well done. And despite this being a movie that doesn't have any, cheap jump scares, it really is eerie in a way that like the ending of Presence felt, where I got the chills and it was just the right amount of wrong,
Presence is an interesting sort of point of comparison as a kind of it sort of treats a truly familiar, it's just a family house, but it sort of shoots it and treats it like a liminal space in a way.
Sure. Yeah.
And it does have that kind of quiet aesthetic. Talking about Steven Soderbergh's movie Presence, where the entire movie is from the POV of a ghost sort of observing everything in this house. And so the effect of it is a kind of eerie, floaty, gimbal, sort of literal presence, in the house. But yeah, that wasn't a connection I had made, and it is an interesting one.
Yeah, I mean, just that the payoff that you get for your patience, throughout this film. And Presence is a much slower film, I would say, than Backrooms, even though a lot of people criticize it for being slow. I saw Eugene was trashing it on Letterboxd. Eugene Kotlayenko, friend of the pod, but I mean, that guy's got a lot of opinions.
Friend of some of the pod.
But
I know, but he has interesting opinions on Letterboxd for sure. And I mean, that movie is I completely understand your mileage varies. I kind of just love everything Soderbergh does and sort of think of
I meant he was trashing Backrooms, but
I see. Interesting. Okay, yes. There's been divisive opinions about it. I mean, and especially with Obsession as well, which we can maybe segue into, because I do want to do a little box office corner because of how significant what's happening right now is. But every other person I talk to either hates Obsession and loves Backrooms or vice versa. Right. I like both of them a lot. They are very, very different movies, and I get why they're getting compared. I don't really think they have anything in common other than being by 20-year-old YouTubers and coming out at similar times and breaking box office records and are relatively low budget. So that is a lot in common. But in terms of textually, I think they have very little in common. Right. But it is interesting. Like I will receive any criticism of either of these movies because I think that there's something interesting about them to talk about. I don't love this movie so much that I think that people that trash it are wrong, Yeah.
I mean, but also, and I do think it's, I mean, as I get older, I remember a friend of mine once told me that when they watch movies, they're not even really looking to see if it's good or bad anymore. It's just interesting or uninteresting.
Sure.
And I think with this film, like, look, the ending. I'm a little reminded of something that actually I remember, like, Pitchfork wrote about my first record that at face value I took as a slight, but the more I thought about it, the more it actually felt like a very apt description, which was that my first record was like akin to buying a pair of pre-faded jeans. And it's true. Like, the idea of wear and decay as a signifier of memory and time, which is a lot of what this film is about. You know, Backrooms is literally where memory goes. And I don't think it does it in a particularly deep or sophisticated way. But to be fair, like, the filmmaker's 19. Like, I don't think he knows entirely what the Backrooms are per se, but he certainly knows a lot about how they make him feel. And I think that's the important part.
I agree with that. And I think I don't want to give him any qualifiers for his age, but I do think that I guess what I'm getting at and is similar to what you're saying is that, like, I'm okay with it not being intellectualized. And I think that there's enough sort of real stuff in this movie that maybe doesn't all fit together right, but is enough for an interesting experience. And I mean, I think that, like, there's a lot of times, and I'm not saying that this film even touches as close to the worst thing that David Lynch ever, you know, shot out on his website. But I do think that, like, you know, there's a lot of stuff that David Lynch made where he's just throwing a bunch of interesting stuff at the wall. And I'm not talking about the towering masterpieces and stuff. I'm talking about, you know, like,
he was a prolific guy.
He was an early web pioneer as well, you know, with davidlynch.com. Like, you ever want to see something like a genius make something really bad? Go watch Dumbland, his animated web series, you know?
Well, before we go into the box office of it, because I do think it's worth discussing this paradigm shift that a lot of people seem to be describing, I do want to just mention that the film ends with a Boards of Canada song off of their new album, Inferno.
Oh, yes. You need to tell me all this context, too, because isn't, like, the Trump administration using Boards of Canada stuff,
well, that
too?
was just I mean, they just love to make everything about themselves and just suck the fun out of the room. But the whole point is that Boards of Canada is releasing their first album, or just released their first album in 13 years. So obviously there's a lot of kind of TikTok trending stuff, which I'm surprised.
Tell me about Boards of Canada as a start.
Yes. But yeah, basically, because they're coming out of hiding and they are this very anonymous, mysterious band that has been around, or producer duo, since the 90s. You know, naturally some fucking dipshit at the White House, you know, running their social media is like, ooh, this is the TikTok thing trending. And the irony, I posted something about it with the song One Very Important Thought, which is their monologue. It's like the end of Music as a Right to Children, which is kind of perceived, you know, for a lot of people, that's like their crown jewel record. But there's a really great outro to the album that sounds like a PSA, like this weird lost, you know, 70s PSA, where it's about censorship. And, you know, this woman is just saying, like, the same people that would have you not, the same people that would stop you from listening to Boards of Canada might be back next year to complain about a book or a TV show. When you can be told what to hear and see, it can then be told, it can then be said that you will be told what to say or think. You know, so there's this whole thing that I thought was very ironic of them posting dystopian, like, helicopter footage and, like, rounding up migrants to this music that was intended to kind of be critical of fascism. But anyway, so you know, this song, The Word Becomes the Flesh, off of their new album, which I thought was a perfect choice because of this idea of music as memory. They are, to me, like, the idea of music as memory and all these things we're talking about, whether it be chillwave, vaporwave, whatever the fuck you want to call it, they are the undisputed godfathers of, like, the score. And apparently also the score that Kane did with Ida Van Bremen, this composer that seems to work with Osgood Perkins a bunch.
Yeah,
was
it's we
heavily.
should, it's a bunch of Osgood Perkins crew that sort of, and he's a producer on the movie.
Yeah.
It's his DP that shot it as well, and yeah.
So they claimed that they were heavily inspired by Boards of Canada. And I know some people in our comments were asking if we would do an episode on Boards of Canada, and I didn't think it was possible until I saw Backrooms this weekend. So there you go. But yeah, before Vaporwave, before any of the waves, there was BOC. They came up in the 90s under revered electronic label Warp, which, has Aphex Twin, Broadcast. I mean, it's a legacy label that has an endless roster of great bands, including
Right, okay,
Dan,
I know
including
Warp. Yeah.
including One of Tricks Point Never. But they were the first to kind of make this like sun damaged retro futuristic music. And they're certainly one of the big reasons I make music. And even Seth, who scored your film, otherwise known as Comtrues, I don't think
Right.
he would exist without Boards of Canada either. Like we all
Scored my last film, Private Property.
Yes. So and look, this is a very random and honestly kind of sensitive story for me. But in high school, after an intense psychedelic trip, I developed like a mild form of visual snow syndrome. Like it's otherwise known as persistent perceptual syndrome. And there's actually a really great Channel 5 Andrew Callahan doc about it.
Oh, wow.
Which apparently because he has it, apparently. But apparently like 5% of people that try psychedelics get it, and it sucks. It's like TV static vision, and there's like intensified floaters, and it honestly like never fully went away. It's mostly in very low lighting that I notice a little bit of like the static. So it's not, it's fucked up. It's not a neurological impairment by any means, but just a visual one. I think Andrew's case of it is maybe more serious, but one
Don't
thing
do
that
drugs, kids.
yeah, no, for sure. Definitely not while your brain's developing. I think that's because it was a similar thing. He was like 15 and he did like a heavy mushroom trip. But one thing that Callahan talks about after he got it was that he had this sort of depersonalization episode that lasted years, and it made him severely depressed. And I can relate to that because there were these intense 6 months where I was in this like brain fog thinking like, fuck, dude, like, did I give myself brain damage? And nothing felt entirely real because of the static vision. And the sky had this sort of weird feeling that it had a ceiling to it. Like it's very backroomsy, very liminal spacey. But this was around the time that I started listening to Boards of Canada, and it was kind of this like terrifying music, but also fascinating. And it just sounded like a copy of a copy of a copy, which I'd later bring to the table when I started making music as Neon Indian.
Very interesting.
Oh yeah, sorry, that was maybe a little intense, but I have a very strong connection to Boards of Canada because it came to me in a time in my life where I was like, whoa, like I was like in a psychedelic.
And so
fog.
they use a Boards of Canada song as the end credits.
Yes, but I mean, what's strange about it is that it's off the record that came out this week. So I'm very curious to know: did A24 reach out to Boards, or did Warp reach out to A24? Like, what was the story there?
I don't know, but you could imagine a world where they tempted they did a temp score using Boards of Canada songs, and then created their own score, and then through that process maybe reached out to them or heard that there was a new album coming out and see if they could have some synergy there.
Oh yeah, totally. And I mean, I'm jealous
cool.
because I thought that I would be well, technically the first needle drop. The only other needle drop I know of that Boards of Canada has in a movie is Morven Caller, because Warp did the whole soundtrack.
Amazing movie.
Yeah, but they've yet to score an entire film, so let's see about that. All right, let's talk about the box office here. Let's talk about this phenomenon.
I'm gonna be a bit of a box office nerd for a little bit here, just because I think what's happening right now is pretty unprecedented, and feels like something of a changing of the guard and sort of paradigm shift. I'm sure people will say, and there's already been like backlash to this, of like people sort of overreacting and people preemptively accusing Hollywood of learning the wrong lessons from this. But these things don't happen overnight, but there are moments, you know what I mean? And I think this is undeniably one. So I'm going to talk about 3 movies really quickly over the last 3 weekends, and that is Obsession, Backrooms, and The Mandalorian and
Grogu.
Grogu. Okay.
Yeah.
So just to sort of set the board here, Obsession, which is another horror movie by another YouTuber that was made independently by some, experienced producers, but sort of, in the sense of like, hey, kid, your YouTube stuff is good. Like, I do a thing where I give like 500K or 750K to like filmmakers I like, and you go make the movie and we see what happens. And that's so, which is very different than what A24 did with Backrooms, right? But out of this came a movie called Obsession, which reportedly cost around $750,000. I wouldn't be surprised if once it was picked up, they put a little bit more money into it for sound design and score and VFX. But I'm still, from everything I've heard, that number is about right. And this is directed by Curry Barker, who's a YouTuber. I'm sure everyone knows the premise of this movie. It's interesting in contrast to Backrooms, because while Backrooms is very sort of like vibey and ethereal, and you kind of can't pin down what it's really about, like Obsession is very much about one thing. It has one clever kind of premise that is sticky, that everyone sort of thought of or fantasized about in their life, and then it just hammers that idea down to the ground in 90 minutes. And which I think really works and is entertaining and fun and great. So that movie opens, the weekend of May 15th to $17 million, which is already great because the movie costs almost nothing.
Its budget. Yeah.
It premiered at TIFF in September of last year. It was bought by Blumhouse and Focus, subsidiary of Universal. Blumhouse has a long time deal with Universal, and for $15 million. So that was already a huge success for them. But for them to make their acquisition price back in the first weekend is already huge, right? And it opens, second to or third place after the third weekend of Michael and the first weekend of The Devil Wears Prada 2. Or the second weekend of Devil Wears Prada 2, fourth weekend of Michael, sorry. So already very impressive, pretty great per screen average. I'm sure everybody's thrilled by this. Now, you should understand that traditionally, and not just traditionally, I'm talking about like 99% of horror movies are super front loaded, okay? Meaning like they make the vast majority of their money in the first weekend, and that's true of all movies, by the way. Like 95% of all movies make most of their money in their first weekend, and that's why you can kind of measure their success by what is called a multiplier. So like, whatever a multiplier is, like the first weekend versus the overall total, right? So like a bad multiplier, which happens a lot, especially with horror movies, is something like 2x or 2.5x, right? It might open to 50, but then it only crawls to 100 total, right?
Yeah.
And a great multiplier, like something like, the first two Avatar movies or The Greatest Showman, or movies that have what they call strong legs, that could be 5 or 6 or even 7x, right? And that shows a really robust, like long tail, plays for a long time. Like Titanic has something like a 12 multiplier, like something insane. Okay? So lo and behold, so it opens really well, and we're like, great. So Obsession, which only costs under $1 million, but with its acquisition price is more like 15. It'll easily get to 50, and everybody will be happy. Great. Cut to next weekend, May 22nd. Obsession grows. It grows by 39%. Its second weekend, it makes 23, almost 24 million. It's still in second place. That already is insanity. That is not something that ever happens. Okay. Like The Sixth Sense especially in horror. The Sixth Sense is a movie that held like that in its first 4 or 5 weekends. It went like down by 5%, 10%, and then on his fourth weekend went back up by like 20%. But we're already in like insanely rarefied air by now. For it to go up by over a third of its first weekend is already completely unprecedented. So now what everyone thought it might end up to, it's already at its second weekend, okay?
Yeah.
And then Mandalorian and Grogu, it opens the now let's be clear, this is the first Star Wars movie in 7 years, a franchise that used to be the diamond cut, platinum, rarefied air. Nothing else on earth compares to the importance and cultural cachet of Star Wars, and that Disney has spent the last decade turning into television, aka disposable, forgettable bullshit that no one
Yep.
cares about. And lo and behold, the result of their diluting this brand, Star Wars: The Mandalorian and Grogu opens to 81, which is pathetic for a Star Wars movie. For it to not even make it to 100 in its 4-day holiday weekend is already disastrous. It opened worse than the worst bomb of Star Wars before this, which was the Han Solo movie.
Right.
So already terrible, right? When this came out, I joked to my friends and said, I think that Star Wars is going to be third in its second weekend, which was the next weekend, which is already a disastrous like joke that this could possibly happen, that like Star Wars would not be number 1 at least 2 weekends in a row, or at least number 2. And then last weekend, the Backrooms opened, and it opens to 81, which is the same, essentially the same number that Star Wars opened to. So Backrooms opens to 81 off a $10 million budget. Obsession in its third weekend goes up again, goes up by 14% from its second weekend. Now we are in the only comparison, we're in the case of the only comparison that is relevant is Jaws.
Yeah.
Okay, that is the comparison to what Obsession is doing right now. A 50-year-old phenomenon that changed the industry forever. Okay, the kind of numbers that Obsession is doing, the only comparison is the theatrical release of Jaws in the summer of 1975. Okay, so now we have Backrooms at number 1 at 81 million, Obsession in its third weekend at 27 million, and Star Wars: The Mandalorian and Grogu in third place for 24 million. And in comparison, Star Wars went down by 70% from its first weekend. A truly pathetic display. So now we have these 2 low-budget horror movies that are somehow also not doing these insane record-breaking numbers at the same time as each other. Like, they are not cannibalizing their audience. Like, that is what's so crazy about it too, is that like people are going to both. Okay.
Yeah.
Like, so I think, and then we have this weekend coming up, which I'm not sure what's going to happen. It's the Scary Movie reboot is going to come out, and which is also technically horror, by the way.
Sure.
So I think that is going to open really well, actually, and surprise people as well. Like, if that opens to something like 50, I think that could be really great for those movies, which are relatively cheap as well. Now, that'll have a steep drop off. Like, that won't last long.
Oh, yeah.
And then
yeah.
Masters of the Universe reboot, which I think is going to bomb. But I think that, like, we could live in a world where Backrooms and Obsession stick into the top 5 with 2 more wide release studio movies coming on their heels. So all that's to say, it's a truly unprecedented paradigm shifting weekend last weekend, where you have like these 2 20-something-year-old filmmakers making essentially independent or independent adjacent original horror movies that do not have bankable stars in them. In one case, have total nobodies in them, and the other have recognizable actors that are Academy Award nominees, but not like box office actors. And
Yeah,
you have
yeah,
them
yeah.
obliterating the most important legacy brand, on in existence. Like you couldn't write a more apt sort of paradigm shifting moment. And I think it's just very exciting because whatever you think of Obsession and Backrooms, and even if you think that they are flawed or you don't like them, they are not slop. They are not streaming slop that like is being forced into a theatrical release.
Which is
Like,
what I heard about The Mandalorian and Grogu, is that
yes, of
it
course.
basically is just
They
like
they
three
are they are
episodes.
they are
Yeah.
well made
Fused.
movies with intention, and I am for those doing well at the box office always. And so it's just a very, very exciting time, and I hope Hollywood, learns good lessons from that. And it's not necessarily, we have to find filmmakers on YouTube, although it's not the worst idea in the world, frankly. Like I think there's been a few decades of people kind of obsessing over finding filmmakers off of shorts or early features at a festival. Well, those people have never had to maintain or create, or let alone maintain, a mass audience before, and a lot of YouTubers have. And that is a filmmaking skill that they don't teach in film school, and that festival filmmakers don't often learn. So it wouldn't be the worst thing in the world for them to kind of search these viral filmmakers out. In any case, I think it is a really exciting time for the movies. It proves that Gen Z and younger actually will go to the theater and want to seek out
If it's the right idea and if it
interesting
appeals to
new
them,
films, if it's
Yeah.
something that appeals to them. And it also proves that that movie making is alive, because you have these Gen Z YouTube filmmakers that want to be legitimized by a theatrical release. Like it's I think telling to me and exciting that they, in their minds, jumping to the next level means making theatrical feature films. So
Right.
I don't know how you can argue that theatrical feature films are dead or dying if that's the case. So all that to say, it's very exciting. Go see these movies in a theater, bring your friends. They're worth it, even if they're not perfect. And I'm excited to see sort of what comes out of this.
Well, regardless of whether you think they're good or bad, you certainly can't say that they are uninteresting. But I agree in that it feels like a paradigm shift. I hope it sticks. I hope, again, that Hollywood learns the right lessons from this. We have had these kind of runaway hits before, but this does hit a little bit different, and especially generationally. I mean, we're not talking about Oppenheimer going up against Barbie. We're talking about, one relatively unknown filmmaker and one person that had a very strong YouTube following, but was still a gamble to see if people would leave the house to go see that movie. And as it turns out, this IP's got legs, despite the fact that it's paradoxically an IP with no one distinct author to say. And seeing that phenomenon grow from curios of the internet into a worldwide box office success is humbling. It's exciting. So, all right, guys.
Yes, and I think the differences between these films and something like Iron Lung, which also is an interesting story, but Iron Lung is a sort of like, also made by a YouTuber, was made sort of on YouTube. He put it out in theaters, independently himself, and it did make a lot of money. It made like $50 million. But that was an example of a popular YouTuber getting his audience into a theater for a sort of exclusive event with him.
Yeah.
I think that these two movies transcend that. I think that the majority of both of these audiences have never seen either of these filmmakers' YouTube work. That might have been the start of some of the rumbling and some of the buzz, but there's not a one-to-one correlation. I think it is the filmmaking skills that they learned on their YouTube shorts that are translating to appealing to a mass audience, as opposed to bringing their direct audience from their laptops to the big screen. That is not what I think is happening, and is why I think this is so significant.
And I can't wait to see Netflix create industry plants inside of YouTube to lab grow these YouTube influencers turned filmmakers.
Yeah. I might be one of them, baby. Thanks for listening to This Podcast Should Be Played Loud, created, produced, and hosted by Chad Harbold and Alan Palomo. Please remember to rate, review, and follow on your favorite podcast platform, and keep up to date on new free and bonus episodes at patreon.com/This Podcast Should Be Played Loud. Our artwork is by Robert Beatty, and special thanks to Marie Barty and Jorge Palomo.